What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the top 5 games in the SEC this year. But before I do, if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But starting things out, there were probably 9 or 10 games that I really highlighted when I was looking over the SEC schedule, and there were probably 4 or 5 more that at least looked intriguing. But first, I'm going to go over kind of some of those games that didn't quite make the cut for this video, but could easily have been in that number 5 spot even. The one of the first couple games of the season, Florida at LSU and Georgia at Tennessee. Both of those games are week 3. Ultimately, obviously, early games can have a big decider on the college football playoff picture, but I don't think those games are quite to the level that games are later in the season. Kind of similarly, an under-the-radar game is South Carolina at Missouri in Week 4. I think South Carolina, outside of Florida, is one of the teams that people expect to be a riser this year because of their quarterback, Lenoris Sellers, and the team that Shane Beamer has there in Columbia. So the Gamecocks are also a team to watch, and the Tigers have been pretty solid under Eli Drinkwitz. They're going to be missing Brady Cook this year at quarterback and Luther Burden at receiver. And even Theo Weiss Jr. So I think this could be a team that takes a little bit of a step back, but this game against South Carolina will be a chance to at least keep themselves in the discussions early on in the conference. A couple of other games that also fall into this category of not quite. Week 10, Florida versus Georgia, for the simple fact of this being a rivalry. This is honestly one I probably would have put in the number 5 spot, but I'll get to that number 5 game. It's simply because that one has been very entertaining the last few years. But obviously, Florida-Georgia is always interesting. I think, if DJ Lagway doesn't get hurt last year, that game is at least a lot closer and very possibly even could have been a Gators win. And then also the Lone Star Showdown, the final week of the regular season, Texas A&M at Texas. A&M continues to just be a disappointment. They have expectations year after year and always fail to live up to those and end up with 8 or 9 wins in the season. Going into now the top 5 games, number 5 in this list is LSU at Ole Miss Week 5. Now you might be thinking, are the Tigers really going to be good enough to be in that college football playoff picture? Is Ole Miss even going to be good enough to be in that picture without Jackson Dart this year? Well, I think this is a game that is always entertaining, and the question for both of these teams is, can they find their way back into the college football playoff picture? Obviously, LSU was last there with that team that included Joe Burrow that just lit up the scoreboard and went on that incredible run under Ed Orgeron at head coach. And for Ole Miss, they've been in those fringe discussions, but this is a game where the winner of this one will really be in that discussion, especially early on. I think this is one of, I talked about some of the other games early on. This is one of the top games early on, and it's actually joined by the number 4 game on my list. At the number 4 spot, you might think this is a little bit low when you hear what it is. I have Alabama at Georgia. After the way this game was played last year, again, you might be thinking, is that a little low for this game? I think it's the appropriate spot. This was obviously probably the game of the year last year. It was either this one or OSU against Oregon 1.0. I think those were the 2 games that were the most entertaining to watch, that were the most back and forth, highest stakes, all that sort of thing, the drama that you want in the big games. The question for me is, will Kalen DeBoer's team be better, and I would say better on a more consistent basis than last year's team? The Crimson Tide had a solid season last year that didn't end very well against Michigan in their bowl game, and obviously they had some disappointing losses in there to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma, but I think, they did show that they were a good team and that they beat Georgia last year. So the Crimson Tide are still going to be there. I really am still not exactly sure what to expect. I think once we see, the roster kind of be finalized after spring ball, or I guess after the spring transfer, because a lot of teams have wrapped up spring football with spring games or whatever. But I think that's exactly where Kirby Smart wants to be, not sure of what they're going to be like as a team, that underdog mentality. Then coming in at number 3 is Tennessee at Florida in Week 13. These two teams I think are obviously, it's a rivalry matchup. They've been playing for years, for decades. Tennessee, last year they were college football playoff participants. They're going to be without Nico Iamaleava after all that drama, heading literally out to Hollywood to play for UCLA, versus I think the team that is the most hyped in the preseason as a riser this season. I think Texas is the team that's going to be the most hyped overall, but when you're looking at a team, which team in the SEC is going to be the biggest riser, I think Florida is up there. They have a really tough schedule, and this is their last test in a really tough season. I think it's not quite to the level of last year, but it's pretty close. They're at LSU week 3. I already briefly mentioned that game. They're also at Miami week 4. They're home against Texas week 6. I'll talk about that game next. Spoiler, I guess. That's my number 2 game. Then they're at Texas A&M the following week in week 7, home against Georgia week 10, and at Ole Miss in week 12. That is a tough schedule to get through, and obviously that includes this game at home against Tennessee. I think Tennessee, I would expect to take a slight step back this year. They lose a couple of really good defensive ends who were drafted highly in the NFL, to the NFL draft, and also obviously Nico at quarterback. So it'll be interesting to see how they do. But I think DJ Lagway and Billy Napier in this Week 13 matchup could be playing for the college football playoff. With that tough schedule, I could see them probably with 2 or 3 losses. I think a lot of people expect them to be really good this year. I don't think they're quite to the level of being, 1 loss or undefeated by this game. Then in that number 2 spot, again, already mentioned this one. This one's in week 6, Texas at Florida. When this game rolls around, I think the Gators could be either 2-2, 3-1, or 4-0. They're not going to have fewer than 2 wins. Their first couple of games are against, what I think will be pretty easy wins. I think one of them is like Long Island, and then they also play South Florida. So I think those are both a couple wins. Then those games against LSU and Miami. I could see them, both those games are on the road. Going to Death Valley is always tough. I think Miami might take a slight step back. They might be one of the better teams in the ACC, but I'm not sure how they'll stack up. So if I had to throw out a guess out there, I think 3-1 or 4-0 is most likely for the Gators. Either way, this will be an inflection point in their season, especially considering that the next week they have to go to Kyle Field to play Texas A&M. If they were to beat Texas at home, first of all, it's a marquee win. This is the type of win that is kind of like Alabama's win over Georgia last year. Georgia, you think, is probably the better team, and it proved that way through the stretch run in the season, but ultimately Alabama was able to get it done at home. I think this is similar, and for Florida, you just got to hope, that what happened with Alabama doesn't happen to them, because it does look like 2 losses is almost a guarantee that you're in the college football playoff. 3 losses kind of put you out of the playoff last year. So this is one where the Gators, can kind of prove it. And then for Texas, this is going to be Arch Manning's first test in the SEC. Obviously, week 1, they're going to Ohio State. That's going to be a tough one at the shoe in Columbus, but this is his first test in SEC play at quarterback, which sometimes I think can be even tougher. Some of those road environments. This will obviously be in a swamp, which I would expect to be rocking unless they lose 2 of those games to LSU and Miami. I think the swamp will be rocking here for this week 6 matchup. Finally, week 12, it's a rematch of the SEC championship game. This is my number 1 game in the SEC in the 2025 season. That's Texas at Georgia. The playoff picture by this point in the season will be coming into shape. It'll be coming together. We'll be able to see which teams are separated, the contenders versus the pretenders. And this is the point in the season too, with it being week 12. There's 3 weeks left in the regular season, so the field will be a little bit wider. And this is where we see, I think, it's not exactly the boldest statement to say, but I think the winner of this game is for sure going to the SEC championship game. And depending on how things shake out, how Georgia does in that game against Alabama, how Texas does against Florida, and in some of their other games, where it's possible even the loser of this game goes to the SEC championship game. But most likely the winner of this game does, and then probably, especially if Florida is able to beat Texas, maybe Florida goes to face either Texas or Georgia, Florida plays both of these teams too. I think, my hierarchy of the SEC right now is probably Texas, then Georgia, and then some sort of mix of probably Florida, Alabama, maybe LSU, Tennessee. All of those teams are probably right there as well. South Carolina could be even in that mix as well. But those are my top 5 games in the SEC this coming season. Let me know in the comments below what your top 5 games are. And my next video, I might do a little bit of draft, recap. It's a little bit past that now, but it's never too late to take a quick little look and give my thoughts on it. But that might be the next video. But coming soon, certainly will be a video where I take a look at my top 5 non-conference games this season. I think there's a pretty clear number one. It's week 1 in the horseshoe, but there's a couple other interesting games that I'll be diving into about that are going to be exciting to watch. But that's all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burnett, signing out. Peace.